This is story of Pearl Harbor, a harbor of still waters, a place where the horizon glows with the first light of the Pacific dawn, where palm trees sway in a breeze that whispers peace. For many, it was a paradise, a posting that seemed safe and far from the storms of war that already raged across Europe and Asia. Battleships sat proudly at anchor, symbols of American strength and security. To those who lived there, both sailors and families, Pearl Harbor was home. Yet history is never so calm for long. Beneath the waters and beyond the horizon, a storm was gathering. Plans were being drawn, decisions sealed in secrecy, and soldiers prepared for orders they could not question. Japan, an empire reaching for dominance in the Pacific, looked at Hawaii not as a distant island but as a target. And in their minds, Pearl Harbor was more than a harbor. It was a gatekeeper to the Pacific, a fleet that had to be destroyed. This story will lead you through the morning that changed the world. You will hear of battleships turned into burning coffins, of planes torn apart on the ground, and of young men awakened from sleep to find themselves in the middle of history's fire. You will meet the rising sun painted on wings of war, and the cries of alarms that shattered a quiet Sunday morning. But not all will be revealed here. The details of the bombs, the ships, the courage and the loss will unfold in the chapters to come. Here we only trace the shadows before the fire, the calm before the storm. Think of the sailors on the decks that night, some writing letters home, some laughing with friends, some closing their eyes to dream of another day in paradise. Think of the families who watched the sunset and believed tomorrow would be like any other. And think of the commanders who trusted in their defenses, unaware that above them, in the dark Pacific, carriers and planes were already moving into position. The story of Pearl Harbor is not simply about ships and planes. It is about choices and consequences, about men and women whose lives were ripped apart in minutes. It is about a nation that was awakened, suddenly and violently, to a new reality of war. This is story of Pearl Harbor, not of the end, but of a beginning that would lead to battles across oceans, sacrifices across generations, and a legacy carved in both stone and memory. It is a story of destruction, but also of resilience, a story where peace was broken, but where unity was forged in fire. History rarely explodes without warning. It builds layer by layer through decisions, ambitions, and the silence of choices not taken. The story of Pearl Harbor begins not with bombs but with the ambitions of empires and the struggle for resources. In the 1930s, the world was already on fire. Europe was falling under the shadow of fascism, and in Asia, Japan had launched a brutal invasion of China. Cities like Nanjing witnessed unspeakable horrors, and the rising sun of Japan seemed determined to cover more and more of the map. Japan's hunger was not simply for territory, it was for survival and power. As an island nation with limited natural resources, Japan relied heavily on imports, particularly oil, steel, and rubber. Its leaders believed that without expansion, the empire would wither. The solution they chose was conquest. By 1940, Japan had occupied large portions of China and set its eyes on Southeast Asia. There lay the rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the tin of Malaya, and the rubber plantations vital for war. But one obstacle stood in their way: the United States. America, though far across the Pacific, had strong interests in Asia. The Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii were stepping stones across the ocean. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet was based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, a fortress of steel and sea power. To Japanese eyes, it was both a threat and a target. At first, words tried to prevent war. American diplomats demanded that Japan withdraw from China and respect international borders. Japanese negotiators, under orders from Tokyo, stalled, hoping to buy time while military plans advanced. Each meeting seemed polite, but beneath the courtesy lay suspicion and mistrust. In July 1941, America struck at the empire's lifeline. President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered a full embargo on oil and steel exports to Japan. For the Japanese Navy, 80% of its fuel came from the United States. Without it, the fleet could not sail, planes could not fly, and expansion would grind to a halt. To Tokyo, this was not just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Japan had at most 18 months of fuel reserves. Something had to be done. The choice Japan made was bold, ruthless, and many believed suicidal. Rather than retreat, they chose attack. In secret, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto crafted a plan that would strike the Pacific Fleet before America could strike them. The heart of that plan was Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was not blind to the risk. He had studied in the United States, admired its industry, and warned his superiors, "If I am ordered to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months to a year. But beyond that, I can give no assurance of success." His warning would prove prophetic. Still, the plan went forward. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, would sail across the northern Pacific. Their mission, launch hundreds of planes in a surprise strike that would cripple America in a single morning. On the American side, life continued almost unaware. Soldiers drilled, but many believed Hawaii was too distant to be attacked. Radar was new, reconnaissance was limited, and although warnings were given by intelligence officers, they were often lost in a flood of reports. Few believed Japan would risk war with a giant like the United States. And so, on the eve of December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor slept. Imagine the scene. 8 massive battleships lined Battleship Row, including the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. Nearby were cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. More than 180 aircraft were parked at airfields across Oahu, lined up wingtip to wingtip, for protection against sabotage, but tragically exposed to air attack. Families lived nearby in base housing. Civilians shopped in Honolulu. Priests gave sermons that Sunday morning. It was paradise, but paradise with blinders on. At the same time, Japanese carrier groups steamed silently across the Pacific, maintaining radio silence, invisible to the world. In Washington, last-minute negotiations continued, but Tokyo had already chosen war. Diplomats were delivering notes that would arrive too late, while the fleet prepared its strike. In those final hours, both nations still held to a fragile peace, though neither trusted the other, and yet, within less than a day, that peace would be shattered by fire, steel, and smoke. This was the path to Pearl Harbor, a clash born of ambition, fueled by resources, shaped by misjudgment, and sealed by decisions that could no longer be undone. The players were set, Japan with its carriers and planes, America with its battleships and bases. The stage was Pearl Harbor, and the curtain was about to rise. War, when it comes, rarely arrives like lightning from a clear sky. It grows hidden in the shadows of ambition and fear. By the winter of 1941, the world was already deep in conflict. But for the United States, still hesitant and distant from the fires of Europe and Asia, war was about to arrive in a way so sudden and violent that it would forever mark history. The purpose of the attack. Japan's empire in 1941 was vast and growing. Its armies controlled Korea, much of China, and had advanced into French Indochina. Yet the empire had an Achilles heel: resources. Without foreign imports, Japan lacked enough oil, rubber, and steel to sustain its war machine. When the United States cut off the flow of oil and steel in mid-1941, the Japanese faced a stark choice: retreat from their conquests, or seize the resources they needed by force. The Japanese military chose force. They aimed to capture the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the tin mines of Burma. But there was a problem. Standing in their way was the United States Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan's leaders knew that if America's fleet was left intact, it could sail across the Pacific to challenge Japanese conquests. Therefore, the logic was cruelly simple. Before striking south, the fleet at Pearl Harbor had to be destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto's plan. The architect of this bold idea was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was no stranger to the United States. He had studied at Harvard, traveled widely, and even admired American industry. More than most, he knew how powerful the US could be once awakened. Yamamoto warned his superiors, "In the first 6 months, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues beyond that, I have no expectation of success." His words were prophetic. Still, he obeyed orders. His plan was daring: launch a surprise aerial strike on Pearl Harbor, crippling the American fleet before it could fight back. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers would sail in secret across the northern Pacific, bringing more than 350 planes. 2 attack waves would be launched, the first to smash the battleships and airfields, the second to finish the job. The chosen date was Sunday, December 7, 1941, a day when American sailors would be resting, commanders off duty, and defenses least prepared. The stage, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a sprawling naval base on Oahu, the heart of Hawaii. To the east lay Honolulu, a bustling city of merchants, sailors, and families. The harbor itself was a lagoon with a narrow entrance, but inside it could hold dozens of ships. On the morning of December 7th, 8 American battleships were moored along Ford Island. This line became known as Battleship Row. Among them were the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Around them lay cruisers, destroyers, and support ships. At nearby airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Kaneohe, and Bellows, nearly 400 aircraft stood ready, though many were lined up wingtip to wingtip, more concerned about sabotage than an aerial strike. In total, more than 140,000 military personnel and civilians were on Oahu that morning. Few suspected they were hours away from war. The approach. On December 12, 1941, Yamamoto's strike force, known as the Kido Butai, received the order: climb Mount Nitaka. This was the coded command to begin the attack. By December 6, 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Tsukikaku, steamed silently 230 miles north of Oahu. With them came 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. At dawn on December 7, the first wave of aircraft prepared to launch. The sky was clear, the sea calm. Japanese pilots bowed before their flags, some whispering prayers. At 6 a.m., the first wave, 183 aircraft, rose into the air. First signs of danger. 7:02 a.m., radar warning, On Oahu, 2 U.S. Army privates at the Opana radar station saw something unusual. A huge formation of planes appeared on their screen, approaching from the north. They phoned in the report, but the officer on duty dismissed it. B-17 bombers were expected from California that morning, and he assumed that's what the radar showed. The warning was ignored. The first wave, 7:55 a.m., the attack begins. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The air raid sirens wailed as Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor. Torpedo bombers skimmed low across the water, targeting Battleship Row. Dive bombers screamed down on airfields, dropping bombs on hangars and runways. Fighters strafed American planes still parked wingtip to wingtip, destroying them before they could take off. USS Arizona, 8:10 a.m. At 8:10 a.m., tragedy struck the USS Arizona. A Japanese bomb pierced her deck and ignited her forward magazine. In a split second, the ship erupted in a massive explosion. The blast tore through steel and flesh alike, killing 1,177 men. The Arizona sank, becoming a tomb for her crew. USS Oklahoma. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes. She rolled onto her side within minutes, trapping more than 400 sailors inside. Rescuers would later cut into her hull, but many never escaped. Other battleships. The USS West Virginia was hit and sank to the harbor floor. The USS California took torpedo and bomb hits, settling into the mud. The USS Nevada attempted to escape the harbor but was bombed and forced to beach herself. The Tennessee and Maryland were damaged but survived. The airfields. Across Oahu, American airfields were devastated. At Wheeler Field, fighters were strafed and bombed. Nearly 100 men were killed. At Hickam Field, hangars collapsed in flames, killing more than 180 men. At Kaneohe, seaplanes were shredded on the water. At Bellows, aircraft burned where they stood. In less than an hour, more than 180 American aircraft were destroyed. The second wave. 8:50 a.m. Renewed assault. At 8:50, the second wave arrived. 170 more Japanese planes. Their targets were the remaining ships, shipyards and fuel depots. Dive bombers struck the USS Nevada as she tried to escape, forcing her aground. The USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock, was hit, along with destroyers Cassine and Downs. The sky filled with smoke and fire. Anti-aircraft guns finally roared in reply, but the damage was already done. 9:45 a.m. The attack ends. By 9:45 a.m., the Japanese planes were gone. In just under 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet had been shattered. The toll was horrific. In 1,403 Americans killed, including 68 civilians. The Dory Salsters 178 wounded. 21 ships sunk or damaged. The 188 aircraft destroyed. 159 damaged. Japan lost only 29 planes and 5 midget submarines. Yet the attack was incomplete. America's aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. The Japanese also failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's vital fuel tanks and repair facilities. These oversights would prove critical in the months to come. Pearl Harbor was not the only target. On December 7 and 8, Japan struck the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, and British Malaya. In one swift blow, the Pacific was aflame. Pearl Harbor, however, became the symbol, the moment America could never forget. The purpose fulfilled, or failed. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted terrible losses, but their true purpose to cripple America long enough to secure an empire was already doomed. Instead of breaking American will, the attack steeled it. The very next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His words still echo through history. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. What Yamamoto had feared became true. Rather than negotiate, America declared war. And within 4 years, the empire that struck Pearl Harbor would be reduced to ashes. Pearl Harbor was meant to be the beginning of Japan's triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of its end.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was not confined to the ships. While Battleship Row burned, Japanese pilots fanned out across Oahu, striking the airfields that were the island's eyes and claws. If America's aircraft could get off the ground, the surprise could turn into a battle. So the Japanese strategy was merciless. Destroy the planes before they ever left the runways. At Wheeler Field, the hub of the Army's pursuit squadrons, American aircraft sat lined up neatly, wingtip to wingtip. It was standard practice, easy to guard against sabotage, but it also made them perfect targets for bombers. At 8 a.m., dive bombers swooped down like hawks on prey. Bombs tore through hangars, igniting fuel tanks. Airplanes that had taken months to build were reduced to burning skeletons in seconds. Soldiers ran across the tarmac, some trying to drag planes apart to save a few from the chain of explosions, others firing pistols uselessly into the sky. In the barracks at Wheeler, men were caught sleeping, struck down before they even understood what was happening. A young private later recalled, "The ceiling came down on me. I woke up in smoke, men screaming in the dark. Nearly 100 men would die there before the morning was over." At Hickam Field, the bombs fell even heavier. Hickam was the Army's main bomber base, with B-17s and B-18s parked in perfect rows. When the first wave struck, explosions tore through the flight line. Huge hangars collapsed, burying men inside. The barracks took a direct hit. Walls crumbled, fires spread, and men clawed their way through rubble to reach open air. Nearly 200 men were killed there alone. A few American planes did manage to get into the fight. At Halaiwa Field, 2 pilots, Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, had spent the previous night at a dance in Honolulu. When the the attack began, they jumped into their cars, raced to their airfield, and took off in their P-40 Warhawks. Against overwhelming odds, they engaged Japanese planes in the skies above Oahu, shooting down at least 6 enemy aircraft between them. Their actions gave Americans a story of defiance in the midst of disaster. At Kaneohe Naval Air Station, Japanese fighters swept low, guns blazing, ripping apart patrol seaplanes moored in the bay. Hangars burst into flame as men scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns. A machinist named John Finn, despite being wounded multiple times, dragged a .50 caliber gun into the open and kept firing at the attackers. For his courage, he would later receive the Medal of Honor, the first awarded in World War II. Bellows Field, though smaller, was hit as well. The planes there, lined in neat rows, were shredded by strafing runs. Few survived the onslaught. Across all of Oahu, the skies were chaos. American anti-aircraft fire finally began to fill the air, black bursts of shrapnel against the morning sun. Sailors and soldiers manned guns they had never fired before, learning in the moment of crisis. Civilians, watching from rooftops, saw dogfights overhead, American planes trying desperately to climb, Japanese fighters diving like hawks. The airfields were broken, but not silenced. Out of the flames came stories of ordinary men who, without orders, without preparation, simply fought back with whatever they could. Pearl Harbor was not just a battlefield of soldiers and sailors. The island of Oahu was home to civilians, families, workers, children who suddenly found themselves in the middle of war. In Honolulu, church bells rang as Sunday services began. Families were walking to mass, children in their best clothes, when the first explosions shook the ground. People looked toward the harbor and saw rising columns of smoke. Some thought it was a drill, others a fire. But then Japanese planes roared overhead, machine guns chattering, the red circle of the rising sun painted clearly on their wings. Civilians ducked for cover as stray bullets and bombs fell into neighborhoods. Houses near Pearl Harbor were shredded by shrapnel. A bomb intended for Hickam struck a residential block, killing families who had been eating breakfast moments before. In the confusion, telephone lines jammed, rumors spread. Some said paratroopers were landing, others swore an invasion was coming. Children cried in the streets as parents dragged them into basements and improvised shelters. The smell of burning fuel and cordite drifted across Honolulu. Windows shattered from concussive blasts. Schools, homes, and shops shook with each explosion. On rooftops, civilians watched in stunned silence as black smoke billowed upward. Some even waved at the first wave of planes, not realizing until too late that they were enemies. Others climbed to vantage points and filmed or photographed the attack, leaving behind haunting images of that morning. Doctors and nurses rushed to overflowing hospitals. The wounded came in waves. Sailors burned head to toe from oil fires. Civilians torn by shrapnel. Children dazed and bloodied. At Tripler Hospital, doctors worked without pause, performing amputations on tables not meant for surgery, using every available hand to save lives. Churches opened their doors as shelters. Priests and pastors comforted the terrified, organizing prayer as bombs echoed in the distance. Schools became improvised morgues. The Red Cross, unprepared for such catastrophe, began collecting blood from volunteers who lined up by the hundreds. The chaos also brought moments of selfless courage. In Honolulu, civilians carried buckets of water to help extinguish flames from burning buildings. Some drove trucks into the inferno to evacuate the wounded. Bus drivers ferried soldiers to bases without charge. Others simply stood in awe and terror. One woman later recalled, "We could see the faces of the pilots. Some of them looked so young. And then the bombs fell, and our world changed forever." By the time the last planes left, Honolulu was no longer just a Hawaiian paradise. It was a city at war, scarred by smoke and grief. Civilians would never again feel distant from the battles of the world. When the last Japanese planes banked away and the roar of engines faded into the distance, Pearl Harbor was left smoldering. But the battle was not over. For the survivors, the fight had only shifted from resisting the enemy to saving each other. Along Battleship Row, men leapt into the oily water, black smoke curling above their heads. Rescue boats sped from ship to ship, pulling sailors from burning patches where flames licked across the surface. Some men dove again and again, dragging unconscious comrades to safety, coughing as fuel clung to their lungs. At the USS Oklahoma, which had rolled completely onto her side, tapping could be heard from within the overturned hull. Dozens of sailors were trapped in compartments, pounding desperately for help. Rescue crews climbed onto the smoking wreck with cutting torches, slicing through steel plates to reach the men inside. Some were freed, dragged gasping into the daylight. Others fell silent before the torches could reach them. Firefighting was everywhere. Teams of sailors and civilians hauled hoses across docks, blasting water at walls of flame. At the USS Arizona, hoses hissed uselessly against a fire that would burn for days. On other ships, fuel-fed blazes spread from one deck to another, threatening to consume them entirely. Fireboats circled, pumping seawater onto the inferno, while men fainted from heat and smoke. Amidst the chaos, chaplains moved among the wounded and dying, offering prayers, words of comfort, or simply holding hands. One Catholic priest, Father Aloysius Schmidt, died helping sailors escape a flooding compartment, pushing others ahead of him until he could no longer get out himself. Nurses, untrained for combat wounds of this scale, worked without pause. At makeshift stations, tables became operating rooms, sheets became bandages, and morphine supplies dwindled dangerously. They moved from patient to patient, burns, shrapnel, broken limbs, doing what they could in the absence of enough doctors. By mid-morning, the harbor was a graveyard. The Arizona burned fiercely, her shattered hull settling into the mud. The Oklahoma lay on her side, half submerged. The Nevada, beached to avoid blocking the channel, smoked quietly at the edge of the harbor. Men staggered through blackened oil slicks, faces unrecognizable from soot. Civilians arrived to help however they could. Some brought food, blankets, and water. Others volunteered to donate blood as the Red Cross set up emergency drives. The line stretched around blocks, hundreds waiting silently, stunned but determined to help. Amidst the confusion, rumors spread of another attack. Some feared Japanese troops would land on Oahu by nightfall. Military police patrolled streets, ordering blackouts as evening approached. Anti-aircraft guns remained manned, scanning the empty skies. By noon the noise had faded. The guns were quiet, the planes gone. What remained was a strange silence, broken only by the crackle of flames, the coughs of the wounded, and the groans of twisted steel. The harbor's waters were slick with oil, reflecting the dark smoke that blotted out the sun. Survivors sat in small groups on the docks, staring at the ruins of ships that had once been their pride. Some wept openly, others said nothing at all. The shock was too heavy for words. That Sunday morning had begun with calm seas and laughter. By noon it ended with Pearl Harbor scarred, its fleet crippled, and thousands of lives extinguished. The silence was not peace, it was mourning.